Good evening, and thank you for joining Darien Library tonight for our very special program, Representation Matters. Before I introduce our special guest speaker tonight, I would like to thank all of our community partners and co-sponsors on tonight's events, who include A Better Chance, Darien YMCA, the Darien Community Association, the Depot, Darien YWCA, Everwell, Haven, the Mather Homestead, and Barrett Bookstore. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate your support. I would also just like to remind everyone that all of our programs here at Darien Library are made possible through the generosity of the Friends of Darien Library and contributions to our annual campaign. So friends, we thank you so much for your support that make exceptional programming like tonight possible, as well as all of Darien Library's books and digital materials and audiobooks and magazines and newspapers and all of the great things we provide freely to our community. I'm Kira Parrott. Hello, I am the director of Darien Library, and it is my great privilege and honor to introduce our special guest speaker this evening, Dr. Simran Jeet Singh. Simran is an award-winning educator, writer, activist, and scholar who believes deeply that love, equity, and justice are closely intertwined. He writes and speaks regularly on issues of diversity, inclusion, civil rights, religion, hate violence, and his thought leadership extends to a number of audiences, including the White House and the Pentagon, to university campuses and social justice groups. In addition to speaking and teaching, this year, Dr. Singh added children's book author to his already impressive resume with the release of his best-selling book, Fauja Singh Keeps Going. I have it right here, The True Story of the Oldest Person to Ever Run a Marathon. And I'm very excited to say that Darien Library is going to be hosting an intergenerational book group program and discussion of this book on Tuesday, February 23rd. So I hope you'll be able to join us. Check out our website to register for that. Our event tonight, as I mentioned, is co-sponsored by Barrett Bookstore. So if you haven't yet, be sure to drop by and grab a copy. It is a wonderful read aloud, inspiring true story, and makes for a wonderful gift. So without further ado, drum roll please, it is my pleasure to open the digital stage, so to speak, to Dr. Singh. Welcome, Dr. Singh. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Kira. My pleasure, and thank you all for being here this evening. I, especially in this moment, it feels like a gift to be with people who are like-minded, who are collectively invested in navigating a world that feels so overwhelming and exhausting and complicated. And I want to honor your commitment this evening by trying to offer some insights that I hope will bring you light and clarity. So my goal for this evening, in this next hour, is to help shed light on the topic of representation, which has become a massive buzzword in our cultural discourse. The main phrase we hear over and over again is that representation matters. And we hear people parroting it all the time, from big award shows like the Oscars, to boardrooms at Fortune 500 companies, to our classrooms, to the cast and characters of our favorite TV shows, to children's literature, to adult literature. It's something that we hear constantly. And my assumption is that if you are here this evening, you probably already have a sense that representation is important, that it does matter, and it's something that is worth spending your time learning about. So I'm not going to try to convince you that representation matters. You're already beyond that. We're already beyond that. And I think what I really want us to spend time thinking about this evening is the question of why and the question of how. And I realize that I'm sounding like the annoying professor, which I am, the professor who's constantly asking you that question. Why does it matter? What are the stakes? Why should we care? Let's unpack that, right? Like, this is what professors say day in and day out, but I don't mind being that stereotype, because I think this question is critically important for us to understand. Because we may have a sense of what we want to change, but we won't be able to do better until we know better and until we know how we want to change it. So I'm hopeful that we can explore a little bit beneath the surface today to deepen our understandings so that we can do better. And the way that I thought I would approach it this evening is to offer you my story, my personal story. And I do that because I think it's an interesting way of exploring the question of representation, because it speaks to what happens in many ways. What happens when we are not represented? What are the costs, and how might we overcome them? And I think my life story is that story in many ways. And I'll share some lessons I've learned along the way. I'll weave in some nerdy academic insights that have helped me better understand what's going on in our world and how we can process it. And as we go through all of this, we'll also address some common pitfalls that come up in how we think about representation that I think are very common, increasingly common in our public discourse. And so that's how we'll approach the evening. My personal approach draws from the wisdom of James Baldwin, who's one of my favorite thinkers and writers. And this insight changed my life. He says, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And so that is what gives me the courage, this wisdom. If I love you, I have to make you give. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. That's what gives me the courage to share my story, so that it might help shed light for all of us going forward. So here's my story. It starts in Texas, which is not what most people think when they see me on the street. I don't look like a stereotypical Texan. My parents immigrated from Punjab, India, in 1970 to San Antonio, Texas. And at the time that they moved there, they were one of the very few South Asian families. Think about that for a second. That's more than 1 billion people in South Asia. And there are a handful of them in San Antonio, Texas in the 70s. And so there was an immediate feeling for them when they immigrated that they were different. And for my father, who wore a turban, he had to answer the question for the first time. What does it mean to choose to look different? Why would I live in this society and continue wearing my turban? What does it mean to me? He'd never had to ask himself that question before, because he lived in a place where not everyone wore turbans, but everyone generally understood what it was about. And he enters into this new space where no one knows what it's about. And he stuck out like a sore thumb, right? Everywhere he went, people would notice him. And this was, to him, before I was even born, the first introduction to what it means to be different, to what it means to be racialized, to be seen as different, and having to process yourself, what it means for your survival, what it means for your safety, what it means for raising children in a country where they would look different. And these were questions that my parents grappled with. And they didn't have long to grapple, because a few years later, my older brother was born. A year later, I was born. 2 years after that, my younger brother was born. And 2 years after that, my youngest brother was born. So in the span of 5 years, my poor mom gave birth to 4 rambunctious, brown-skinned, turban-wearing, sports-loving kids in the south of Texas. And we were literally the only family in all of South Texas that looked the way we did. And I'll tell you, I can give you all sorts of stories about what that was like. But let me tell you first about the feeling, because the feeling, I think, is what we're starting to get at in this conversation around representation. the feeling of isolation that we felt as the only ones, it followed us everywhere we went. So on the one hand, we were happy kids, right? There were four of us. We loved sports. We had lots to do with each other. We never got bored. If we weren't playing sports, we were fighting with one another. And so, four is a good number. We're all close in age. It was a great childhood. We had lots of friends, neighbors, classmates, teammates, soccer, basketball. I mean, it was a good, normal childhood in that sense, right? Like everything that you would expect of typical American boys. And at the same time, incredibly lonely, right? We had all these friends, but our friends didn't really know what it was like to be us. And we didn't really know anyone who felt a sort of connection with our experiences. And so, on the one hand, again, right, this sort of dichotomy of being insiders, being Americans, and feeling like we belonged, and at the same time knowing every time we went to the grocery store and people stared at us, or when we would go to our games and people would say racist stuff to us, right? Like we knew that we didn't really belong. And so it was that sort of tension that we lived in. And here's the challenge for a child growing up in this country to feel like they don't belong. What do you do? Where do they look? Right? They go to their schools and they look on the bookshelves. No one looks like me. We go to the movies, there's nobody who looks like me. We watch sports, nobody looks like me. And so as a parent, what do? How do you raise kids who feel like they don't belong in the very world that they called home? Right? Like I was born and raised in Texas. People in Texas assumed that I wasn't born and raised there, and they definitely didn't think that I belonged there. And so what do you do? What do you do as a parent? I mean, I have kids of my own now, and it is a deep question for us. And we don't live in Texas anymore. We live in New York City. There is much more diversity there, but that question is still sharp in our minds as parents. What do we do raising two brown-skinned daughters in this world where they don't feel like they belong? As girls, as the children of immigrants, as kids who have racial difference, religious difference, right? It's such a tough question. And I'll say this, one of the things that I thought would be my solution to this problem was representation, right? And of course, that's where kids go immediately. Of course, this is why everyone talks about it, because it feels so simple. It feels so simple. If people just knew who I was, my life would be different. I would be welcome. I would belong. People would treat me differently. People would treat me better. But I didn't have that. And I remember as a kid yearning for that so badly. When people would tease me, the first time I got teased, and I think this is important to note just to remember how young this happens, how early it happens. I was in preschool, and I came home very upset, wanting to cut my hair because the other boys had said I had to be the princess in the pretend game we were playing because I had long hair. That's how early it starts, right? And we internalize these things. And so those sorts of experiences repeated themselves constantly throughout my childhood. I'll just throw some examples at you. In fifth grade, I was in fourth. We went to my brother's class party. We went to a roller skating rink that we'd been to dozens of times before, and we got kicked out. No headwear allowed was the rule. Or what the manager really said is get out of here with those damn rags on your heads. Right? This was our experience. So I had to deal with soccer referees doing the same thing, kicking us out of games, basketball games, racist fans, racist opponents, all sorts of stuff. So the point is, this is the context of our lives, and all I want as a kid is for people to see me as human. And the vehicle for that, in a kid's mind, but I think also in many of our minds, is through stories. If someone just saw our story and felt a connection to it, if someone just saw someone who looked like me on a TV show or a movie, they would realize that I'm normal. And we know that racism and bias doesn't work that way, but it helps, right? Representation helps. And so here's the moment that really sticks with me around the particular issue of representation. I'm in elementary school. I go to my school librarian, and we were the biggest nerds. We still are the biggest nerds, my brothers and me. And so we go to our school librarian, Miss Evans, or I went. Um, and I told her, every time I go to a bookstore, I look, and this was true. I remember this too. We'd go to a bookstore or a library, anywhere we went. First thing I would do is there a book on Sikhism, Sikh people, Punjabi people, someone with a turban? And I would just look for that everywhere. And every time I would walk away feeling disappointed. And so one day I go to Miss Evans, our school librarian, and ask her, is there such a book in the world that exists where people look like me? And she says, no, they're not relatable. These stories aren't relatable. And she wasn't being malicious, right? She wasn't being hateful. But what she said hurt. And what it meant to me when she said that was that people don't care about you. People have no interest in your people. People have no interest in your stories. Your stories don't matter. And that really hurt. And it was at that time in elementary school that I made a promise to myself. I said, I hate how this feels. I don't want any other kids to ever feel like this. When I get older, I'm going to write that book. If it doesn't exist at this point, I'm going to write that book. So this is, I think, very much a story of why representation matters from the perspective of somebody who has not been represented, from the story of somebody who has been rendered invisible over and over again all throughout life. The next moment that really sticks out, we fast forward about 10 years. I'm a senior in high school. The semester has just started. School is about to open. It's, the first or second week of school. And then we hear this report. These rumors start flying around the hallways that, did you hear about the attack? And what they were referring to was the terrorist attacks of 9/11. It was September 11th that morning. And my friends and me, we had been, we had sort of created a little pod, a clique, really close with our social studies teacher, Miss Strong. And we go to her classroom. We're all sort of standing next to one another, watching the events unfold on TV, mouths open, just completely stunned, like every other American in this country. And we're watching, it's probably an hour or so passes, and all of a sudden, an image pops up on the screen, and it's Osama bin Laden. And I knew the people standing around me, we were close enough that I knew they wouldn't see me as a terrorist. I knew they knew what I was about. But I also knew that Americans around the country would not know, and that life was about to get very difficult for us. They would see the turban, the brown skin, and the beard, and they would make a quick connection. And the racist backlash that ensued after 9/11 just completely changed my life in a number of ways. Right, there was, I'll tell you specific stories in a moment, but I think it's worth knowing. For the next almost week, we stayed on lockdown at home. We didn't leave. We had death threats and people calling, people driving by. We had everything shut down. We didn't walk out of the house. And we watched TV, and every evening we would gather around the phone and listen to a conference call in which people would report the hate crimes that had happened that day around the country. And 4 days in, the report came of a man in Mesa, Arizona, named Balbir Singh Sodhi. He had become, on September 15th, the first victim of a hate crime after 9/11, the first casualty of a hate crime after 9/11. And his story really shook us. Balbir Singh Sodhi had immigrated from Punjab to Mesa, Arizona, like many immigrants, to seek a better life for his family. He'd become a pillar of the local community. Everyone around knew that Balbir would give free candy to any of the kids who visited, and free gas to any adults who didn't have any cash in their pockets. Like he was just a beloved figure. And let me tell you this about Balbir Singh. On September 15th, that the same day he was murdered, he had gone to the local Costco, and he was so devastated that when he got to the register, he saw a donation box for the first responders at Ground Zero, and he literally took out his wallet and emptied out, like flipped his wallet upside down, emptied out all the cash into the donation box. He didn't think twice. He didn't even look. It was about $100 that he put in. And it was because he felt so hurt by the terrorist attacks of 9/11. He returns to his gas station. A few hours later, a man named Frank Roque shows up in his pickup truck, a Chevy S10, pulls out his .38 handgun, points it at Balbir Singh Sodhi out of his truck window, and fires. And Balbir Singh Sodhi is killed immediately on the spot. And one of the interesting things about this incident, this murder, is that we actually have testimony from the killer about what he intended, which is not always the case in hate violence. He described himself, Frank Roque described himself as an American patriot. He openly stated it was an act of revenge for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He told his wife that all Arabs should be shot, that he wanted to slit some Iranian throats. Eyewitnesses reported hearing him say he wanted to kill some Middle Eastern people. At his trial, one of his co-workers testified that he said, "We should round them all up and kill them. We should kill their children too, because they'll grow up to be like their parents." Roque's own words demonstrate how racism works. Ignorance causes unnecessary tragedy for all of us, simply because people are not willing to look beyond their own prejudices and hatred. And here's where this issue of representation comes in. Representation can be a tool for education, a tool for literacy, a tool for justice. Just imagine the different outcome we would have, right? Maybe Balbir Singh Sodhi would still be with his family today. Maybe Frank Roque would still be with his family today if he had known what he was doing, if he had any sense of who these people were, if he wasn't so confused about what terrorism meant and who a terrorist was, right? It had come out through a sense of racialization. And so this is why I believe that representation is not just an issue of finding equality in some sense. It is an issue of justice. It's very much a practical concern for people like me, where representation can be quite literally the difference between life and death. Now, here's a warning. At a time when we're hearing constantly the refrain that representation matters, we also have to understand that representation in its own right is not enough. And this is something I was confused about as a child, as a teenager, as someone who is coming into his own at this time. I thought then that racism was purely a product of ignorance. Right? I really just believe that if people knew who we were, it comes out of this desire to believe that, people are good-hearted. And I think that can still be true if we acknowledge the systemic nature of racism. But back then, I just thought if people just knew, racism would no longer exist. Now, that's not the full story, but it's definitely part of the story. But the warning here, I think, is worth taking heed, right? Representation is not the same thing as justice. It's not the same thing as freedom. It's not the same thing as equality. It is a tool. It is a vehicle for getting there. It is something that's important for us to do, but it's not perfect. It's not the solution in and of itself. And I'll give you a very nerdy way of thinking about it. Because I'm a professor of culture and history, I am contractually obligated to mention Edward Said every time I open my mouth. And so this is my obligatory reference to Edward Said. He says in his seminal book, Orientalism, which if you haven't read, I would highly recommend. He says in his book, Orientalism, that when outsiders tell our stories, those are representations too. And those representations can be distorted and come to be accepted as fact. And I think that's a really interesting thing for us to think about in terms of representation. It's not just that we need to see people who are different from us. We need to see authenticity in it, right? What he's warning us of in this idea is that when other people tell our stories, those representations are distortions, right? Just think about it from a really practical perspective. You know, turn off your computer after this, you talk to a friend on the phone or a family member, and you say, I went to this really cool talk with this really good looking guy named Simran, and I can't wait to tell you about it. And they say, tell me something. And you reiterate, right? You reiterate what I said here. It's not exactly the same, right? There's no way of capturing exactly the words of what I'm saying. And so there is some level of distortion, right? There is always something lost in translation. And when that happens at a level where the people who are representing don't know the authentic version of the story, right? Like you might get the essence of what I'm saying here and do a pretty good job of representing the main thrust of our conversation. That's very possible, very likely. But what happens when I, for example, know very little about Indonesian culture and I want my next children's book to be about a kid from Indonesia? Like, probably not going to be very authentic, right? I wouldn't have native words. I wouldn't have good illustrations that show what Indonesia really looks like. It would all be imagined, right? That's a distorted representation. Let me sort of close that out with a proverb, an African proverb that helps illustrate this point. And I think we can leave it here because I think you'll get it. The African proverb is, until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. We need the authentic representation, right? Not just some version of a story, but what is an authentic version of a story that we can capture that really helps us get at truth. Representation in and of itself, think of a mirror, right? That's a representation. It's your reflection is not reality. It reveals reality in a dimension, but it's not reality in and of itself. And what we really need to find is this expression of reality that really gets us to authenticity. Okay, so I'll pause there on that story because I know I got a little deep, but I think that's a really important point as we think about what representation means. Here's another point. As I'm coming out of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, right? Remember, I'm a senior in high school, really sort of coming into my own as a human being, maturing, being formed, being forged. That experience very much shaped my life trajectory. And here's what I witnessed in that moment. That there was a major gap in what needed to happen and what could possibly happen given the structure of the world we lived in. And what I mean by that is I was quite literally, and my family and people we knew all over the country were scared for our lives. We were worried about what would happen when we went outside. And it wasn't an overstated worry. We knew not just Balbir Singh Sodhi being murdered, but we knew other people who had been physically attacked. We felt a difference in how we were treated when we went out. People were more emboldened to say things, to do things, um, to vandalize, to damage, and this continued. And what we saw on television was a complete misrepresentation or an absence of representation around our stories. And this felt like, to me, a repetition of something that had happened to us historically. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Um, I belong to the Sikh faith. As part of my faith, I wear a turban. The Sikh religion is the world's fifth largest religion, 30 million people around the world. And yet, no one in this country, hardly anyone knows what a Sikh is or who a Sikh is. A recent study conducted out of Stanford found that 70% of Americans could not identify a Sikh while looking at one. I was on The Daily Show a few years back, and Hassan Minhaj, one of my favorite comedians, did this sketch where he went out to Times Square and he asked people, he had this photo. It was two kids playing hide and seek, birds, and I think it was something like a magnifying glass, and then a Sikh man. And he said, which one of these is a Sikh? And then no one could figure it out, right? Like this is what it means to live as a Sikh in America today. Everyone notices me when I walk on the street. Everyone notices me when I go to the grocery store. Everyone notices me at the airport, right? Like nobody misses me at the airport. Definitely not TSA. So we're hyper visible, incredibly visible, right? In that sense, we are overrepresented, right? Like people have this really deep-seated fear around us, and that representation is strong. And on the other hand, completely unseen, right? No one knows who I am when they see me, wherever they see me. No one knows a thing about who we are as a community. And we're not represented in cultural spaces, whether that be textbooks, right? Like the major textbooks on the world's major religions don't include Sikhism. I know because I'm a professor of religion and I have to do it myself. If we're thinking about uh, identity-based representation in the administration, for example, right? Like you don't see this in the political world. You don't see this in so much in the corporate world. You don't see it anywhere. You don't see it in children's literature. So this feeling of being hyper visible everywhere we go, people notice us, but still feeling invisible at the same time. It's such a strange experience, right? It's almost like being a ghost, where people don't really acknowledge your existence until they're scared out of their minds, right? Until you sit next to them on the airplane and then you have to deal with whatever their fears are in that moment. And so this to me is part of why representation matters so much. Because what happens with what does it do for us when we move beyond tokenism and into representation? What we end up doing is deflattening the stereotypes, right? And I'll give you a very simple yet painful example. And I'll make it really personal, actually. I was just having a conversation about this the other week because I'm a runner, and I was talking to somebody about runner safety because it was just runner safety week. And one of the things we were talking about is it came up because they were talking about what are the kinds of stereotypes that I face as a runner and how people might fear me. And the specific example I gave from my own life was the assumption that if a Black man is running, like Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed this last year while running, the assumption that if a Black man is running, he's running because he's done something criminal. It makes them more likely to be killed, just like Ahmaud Arbery. And where does that come from, right? This is the conversation I was having with my friend. Like, why in my mind, that is a real stereotype, right? Like that is something that I've seen over and over again. And I tried to sort of recall where I'd rehearsed this, and I think it's TV. I think I've seen millions of shows and movies where the way that they indicate that somebody is doing something criminal is that they're running away and the cops chase them and track them down and tackle them. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine that in your heads. And that is how that iteration, that process is how we create flattened stereotypes. It's exactly why when someone sees me on the street or when you see me on Zoom, like the first thing that pops into your head is terrorist, right? We've been conditioned to see that when we see one another. I see a black man, I think criminal. You see a turban and beard, you think terrorist, right? Like those are the messages we get constantly, constantly. Representation can undercut racism, our racist assumptions, our biases that we all hold, because representation can create different iterations that challenge those singular flattened stereotypes that we all hold. I want to give you one more example of what this looks like before we move into questions. And this one, it goes back to that story I was telling you about myself and my librarian and our conversation. And that feeling of pain I had when she said, we don't have books with people who look like you because no one cares. That's when I was in elementary school. Let's fast forward 30 years. 30 years later, or so, my wife is pregnant with our first child. We live in New York City at this point. She was about 7 months pregnant when we started getting serious about getting our daughter's library together. And we were first time parents, so we were ahead of schedule with everything else, you know, the crib and the whatever, all the gadgets that you get the first time you have kids. And so we start looking at the library, and I took that role because I am the bigger nerd in our family. And I start looking for, I start going back to these bookstores and libraries and start looking at the bookshelves. And I realized that from the time I was a kid, nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. I felt that same hurt as I did it came back to me, like it very physically. I felt it very viscerally. There still weren't any books with characters who look like the people in my family. There still weren't any books. They had people who looked like the people I loved. And that was such a hard thing to swallow. And I saw it, I acknowledged it, I accepted it. And I remembered my promise to myself as a kid that I didn't want others to feel that way. And I definitely didn't want our daughter to feel that way. So that's when I revisited my promise to myself that I would write this book. And I started working in earnest. I found the right story. I did a lot of research in terms of children's writing. I had been writing more academic stuff, so I learned how to not be so boring and tell a story that people actually wanted to pay attention to. And believe it or not, you'll probably believe it because, of course, this is how things work in our world. I start talking to publishers and agents, and they tell me the exact same thing the librarian told me when I was a kid. They said, there's no market for this book. They said there's no precedent. There's no proof of concept. Nobody's willing to take a risk on this kind of story because no one's done it before. And as frustrated as that made me more determined. And I said, you know what, this has to change now. It has to change now. Like my daughter's coming into this world, and we're not going forward this way anymore. And so I pulled together this story. The book is published, and you know, fortunately for all these reasons, it landed with my top choice imprint and with this incredible editor at Penguin Random House, and very, very happy with how it turned out. And I want to make 2 points about representation here, actually 3, but I'll tie them together. The first is the book arrives at my door and I take it in. My daughter is 3 at this point, because it takes a lot longer to make a children's book than you'd imagine. My daughter's 3, and I pull the book up to her and I show her an image. I'm pulling it up for you. I show her this photo and she squeals out of excitement. It just squeals with delight. And she says, "Dad, that's you and me." Dada, she calls me Dada. She says, "Dada, that's you and me every morning." And to me, I mean, my heart melted. This is like the most cliche, cheesiest, corniest thing that any parent could ever want. But this, for me, since I was a kid, this had been my dream, right? This is the change that I wanted to make. So that's moment number 1. Moment number 2 comes a week later. I go to her preschool and do a reading for the kids, my first reading. And one of her classmates, they're 3, I'm reading the book, and in the middle of it, I turn a page and she says, "Hey, that's you." And for me, I'm a little bit offended because I don't have a white beard. And so I was like, you're aging me a little bit. But as I thought about it that day, and I didn't fully process it as it happened, I was like, yeah, it's me. And it's actually the character and whatever. But that evening, as I was putting my daughter to bed, I just kept thinking about how powerful that was and what it meant to me for these kids, these 3-year-olds, for the first time, to see a message, to see someone who looked like me as being represented as a hero. And it wasn't, if I'm being honest, this wasn't the primary driver for me to write this book, right? It wasn't for me thinking about what representation does for other kids. I was thinking about myself and my own kids, right? Very, very selfishly in that way. But to think about what representation does as a tool for anti-racism, right? You have a 3-year-old now who, when she sees someone like this on the street, she's not going to think they're terrorist. She's going to think cool guy, right? Like cool guy who runs. What a different kind of story we're giving to our kids, right? What kind of a different kind of message. And now, as she encounters all of the toxic, negative stereotypes that she will encounter, at least now she has a counterexample. At least now. I mean, where else would she have gotten a counterexample? There isn't one. Trust me, I I live in this world, and I want nothing more than this for my kids. There isn't a counterexample. And so that's what representation can do for our kids. It can undercut racist stereotypes, misogynistic stereotypes, homophobic stereotypes, and help them. And this, I think, is the underlying thesis of everything I do. I believe, more than anything else, I believe that if we can teach one another to see the humanity in those who seem the most different, then we can teach one another to see the humanity in everyone that we meet, right? That is the key. That's what our world is missing right now. And let me give you one last anecdote as we wrap this up. About a month after the book comes out, I was traveling with my kids and my wife, and it was the first time my 3-year-old was old enough to process what racial profiling means. We're walking through the metal detectors, and as part of TSA protocol, if you if you look like this, you get the privilege of doing an extra screening. And so I get pulled aside, and I'm used to it by now, right? So I don't. I roll my eyes and whatever. I go do it. But it was the first, and my daughter had seen it, but she had never really understood. And this time she asked. She said, "Why are they taking you?" And she was still young enough that I could deflect it and say, "I'm just going to the side. I'll be right back." But as I'm standing there and, the passengers in line are staring at me and it's humiliating. Like that, the humiliation doesn't get any better over time, trust me. So it's just as humiliating and frustrating. And, I've just dealt with, I've learned ways to process that. But this moment was different. It was the first time I had to accept the fact that my own government would be sending messages to my own daughter that she needs to be ashamed of who she is, that she should be ashamed of her father and her family and her heritage. And I was so broken up by that. I mean, I don't get rattled by much. Even racism, you say whatever you want to me. I've heard it all. Do whatever you want to me. I've dealt with it all. But thinking about what this does to our own children, it hurt. And we got on the plane, and I had packed this book because I was still excited to be a new author and was carrying it around with me wherever. And my daughter pulled the book out of the bag, and she was just flipping through the pages. We weren't reading it or anything, and I was thinking, again, this is the value of the counter narrative, right? That's what representation can do. When I was growing up, there was no counter narrative, right? It might be what my parents told me. But here, my daughter has something to reconcile the negative messages that she's getting from her government about her own family. So very similar to this theme that I was describing with her classmates, right? They see me and see this character in this book as someone to celebrate, not someone to fear. And to think about what that does for my relationship with my kids and what that can do for your relationship with your kids as you're thinking about the kinds of messages society is sending them and how you want to counter them. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing. To me, more than anything else, that's why representation matters. So I'll pause here. I know I've been talking for quite a bit. You can tell I'm a professor and could probably talk all night, but I know we want to make sure we get some comments and questions, and I'd welcome anything from you, whether it's a reflection or a question or anything. Feel free as you wish.
Thank you so much, Simran. This has been really powerful. Thank you for your generosity and sharing with us. I see some questions from the audience. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and put it in the Q&A or the chat. I just wanted to start off with a question myself for you. I know that some of you might know there's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the children's Cooperative Children's Book Center does a study every year where they look at children's books and they assess the identity, racial identity, and so forth of the characters represented in. And I think the last statistic I saw, even though it's been getting marginally better over the last couple of years, there are more children's books with talking trucks and anthropomorphized crayons and things like that than there are in total representations of Black and Brown characters. So I'm just, and we know that is something that the industry has been slow really to react to and slow to correct. Have you found through your publication journey, through your agent and your editors and the folks that you work with, are you feeling less friction? Do you feel like you're able to put more books forth? Are there other authors that you would recommend for parents, especially in the Sikh community? Or do you feel like your book is sort of still like the lone Sikh book out there for kids these days? I mean, how much better is it getting?
It's getting better. That's a great question. So it is pretty, on the one hand, and we can say this about anything when it comes to racial justice in this country, and that's where I really specialize. But I also work generally in diversity and inclusion. We can sort of do the, on the one hand this, and on the other hand the other, and it can be true, right? So on the one hand, children's literature and publishing in general has an abysmal track record when it comes to diversity, especially in this country, and so that is true. And it's also true that that's changing and things are getting better. I think part of that has to do with the public conversation around the importance of diversity, which has been ramping up. Part of that has to do with shifts in the industry, and we're seeing this in other industries as well, which means that more people in positions of power come from diverse backgrounds, and so you are seeing their perspectives being represented in the choices that they make in terms of what's valuable to publish. And the other part of it, I think, and I think this is a real one, one that's worth us acknowledging, is that after the murder of George Floyd and the racial justice protest this past summer, a lot of uh, people, right, us as individuals, as communities, as a country, have been reflecting seriously in a way that I haven't seen before, in a deep way about what it would look like to create more equity. And I want to say also that this is true in the corporate sector as well, and publishing being part of that corporate sector. Um, I work a lot with in the corporate spaces in diversity and inclusion, and it feels to me that there is a substantial shift, and we're seeing that in publishing as well. And so already there was a movement towards making things more diverse: literature, movies, film, TV. And that's accelerated over the past 9 months. And I think it's going to continue as we get newer structures in place. So thank you. It's a great question.
Let's see. I saw a question here. Joan says, I'm so proud of you, Sim. I'd love to hear more advice on how you are helping parents change these narrative for their kids. How else can we respond when they see and hear racist, sexist, hateful things from other people, even authority figures like teachers and so on?
Oh, it's a great question. Thank you, Joan. I think, to me, the biggest failure of our generation and the greatest opportunity for us now as we go forward is to move beyond the colorblind approach to parenting, but also in general as a society, right? Basically, what we have done since the civil rights movement, and it's a vestige of the civil rights era, is that we've told ourselves that the best way to deal with racism is to turn the other cheek, right? And to not acknowledge it. Like, even my own sort of upbringing was, um don't 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 say anything. Like, if you see somebody who is a person of color, and I remember being very young and pointing out somebody with black skin, and my mom was like, shh, don't say that out loud, right? And like, of course that's what you would say, because that's what we've all been raised to do. But what we end up failing to do is talking to our children about unfairness, inequity, injustice. And what happens then is, I'm a college professor. My students come in at the age of 18, and they don't know a damn thing about anything, right? About the real world and what it looks like. And by that point, it's too late, right? They're adults at that point. And so what are we really doing? Like, we're not serving ourselves, we're not serving our children as we parent them when we ignore these issues. We need to, in a very, I mean, I think in a gentle way, it's possible, in a way that as teachers talk about, we scaffold, right? You start young and you build up the concept. So with my 4-year-old and 3-year-old, we talk about unfairness as the basic principle that they understand. And we go from there, right? We're not talking to our 4-year-old about police brutality, but we are talking about um, separate water fountains, for example. That's what they can understand. And as we go along, we can build up. So there's a way to have this conversation that's productive and age appropriate. And I think that's the shift that we ought to be thinking about as parents and educators and as a society.
There's another question. Let's see. Do you think there are any shows or movies from the past few years that are doing a particularly good job on representation?
Yeah, there are lots, and what you'll see is, especially with shows and movies, the every streamer now is demanding diverse content, right? It's starting to become such a hot topic that if you are not putting programs out there that aren't diverse, then you're then you're going to get in trouble. And so here's what I would say in terms of this material. What I try and recommend for people of all ages is that you engage with this material and think about diversity in a diverse way, right? Like, let's not limit our understandings of diversity on the basis of identity, right? Like, so often we say diversity is about racial diversity. We limit our perspectives to that, and we'll say, well, I watched a movie with Black characters, then I watched a movie with Latinx characters, and then I watched, right? Like, that's, I don't think that gets us very far, because what we're really doing then is falling into the tokenism trap, to say, like, I checked a box and let me move on. I get these people, let me move on. What we need to do to really access the full richness of our humanity is to take that intersectional approach and say, what are the different kinds of diversity that I want to humanize, that I want to learn about? Like, who are the people? This is a more maybe engaging, difficult, reflective exercise than you might be asking for when you're asking for movies and TV recommendations. But I find this to be really powerful for myself, right? Like, ask yourself the question, what am I biased about? Who are the people that I judge? And let me learn about them, right? Instead of meeting them with judgment and catching their difference as negative, let me meet their difference with curiosity and just learn about them. And so that can be on the basis of, and we all have these biases, right? So there's, and this is a conversation internally, you don't have to tell me. But what have you been socialized to believe as being bad, right? Is it people who are gay, right? Then look for material, all kinds of media that can help you challenge those biases. Is it people who are from other countries, right? We have those too. We learn about them being inferior and Americans being the best. Is it on the basis of gender? Right, like there are all sorts of ways. Is it people who are older, people with disabilities, right? Like, just doing that exercise, I think, is really liberating, because what it enables you to do is accept it and then work on it and then move beyond it and then keep going, right? Like, that's how you make progress. And I think that's what's really worked for me.
There was a question. I think I may have lost it in the stream, but I think I can recapture the essence of it. And I think the person was sort of getting at the tension between the obvious need for more and more diverse stories and storytelling, but also the recognition when you talk about authenticity. You know, this sort of movement around like the hashtag own voices, like this movement that we don't just want stories told by cultural outsiders who may not get those details right, who may not infuse it with that level of authenticity. What do you say to, you know, where when people are sort of finding that tension, like, well, you're saying we need more diversity, but you're also saying there's sort of gatekeeping happening with who can tell whose
Yeah.
story. What's your thought on that?
It's such a good question, and it's such a hard balance to strike. So I love that question. Um, there are some people who take the position that you have to be of a certain background to represent that background. I'm not one of those people, but that is the case. I tend not to be someone who falls on the extreme in either or in any situation, really. I always find myself falling in the middle. But what I'd say is that there are a few things we can do in these positions or in these situations, right? Like, one, I think it's incredibly important that when we are representing people who are of different backgrounds, that we do our homework. And we don't try and assume things. And you know, this is not so much a conscious problem. We don't do this intentionally, but often we do it by accident when we're just trying to, you know, on the basis of efficiency, right? Like, I don't have much time, let me get it done. Or on, like, just not being malicious, but just thinking like, oh, I know how this works. Like, let me just do this, right? And not thinking about what the other person's life experience might be. And so I think that's one critical thing that creators and people in positions of power don't always do, and it comes back to cause harm. The second thing that I think is important, right? And we can talk about this in terms of people who have positions of influence as creators, right? Like if you're writing a book and you're like, let's say I'm writing a book and I have characters of different backgrounds as I want to do, then what do I do? Like, I'll give you a very I'll give you a very specific example as I'm describing this. It's coming to me in this book. One of the things that I struggled with in this book is that Fojia Singh dealt with disability as a child, and I'm an expert in diversity and inclusion. I teach and facilitate around disability and ableism. I still wasn't able to figure it out. And so what we did was we hired sensitivity readers, disability consultants to come in and give us advice. And that totally changed. It didn't change the story, it didn't change the narrative, but it helped us figure out. We spent probably 2 months trying to figure out, my agent, my editor, and me trying to resolve this problem, and we couldn't do it no matter how hard we tried. And the consultants were able to do it. So this is what I mean about getting other people involved to get that authenticity, because I'm very proud of how it turned out, especially with regard to disability. The other thing I'll say as an answer is, when we think about authenticity in these spaces, and does it always mean that I'm in a position of power, I don't belong to that background, but I want to help, and so let me represent these people? Like, maybe the answer is, in some cases, rather than taking that story and presenting it from your perspective, a more equitable and useful thing you might be able to do is give your power to somebody else, right? And that can be like, let's think about a corporate board, for example, right? Like, those are historically white men, and you could say, well, I want to be one of those white men who empowers women, so I'm going to learn about gender diversity and women's issues, and I'm going to talk about that at the board. Well, that's one thing you could do, but probably more effective, and if you really care about this, and the equity here, is that you instead say, I'm going to step down from my position and insist that I'm replaced with a woman, or I'm going to ask that we add another board member and that we bring in a woman. Like, that's another kind of way to think about what authenticity could look like, in a way that helps you leverage your power to create more equity.
I think that's so powerful. And there was a question in somewhere in the chat about, what can white folks, I'm assuming, can do to be better allies, to help support Black and Brown people in our communities. And I think that, thinking about the power and the privilege, and whether you're white or not, wherever your power and privilege may lie, wherever you have that sphere of influence, thinking about how that can be deployed as a real tool, that's incredibly powerful. This is not a question, it's a comment, but it's such a good one. I have to share it. It's from Rosanna at Barrett Bookstore. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for sharing your powerful story and commitment to representation. Barrett Bookstore is so pleased to have been introduced to your book. We want to give you a bit of a plug. Your book was an NPR Best Book of 2020. It got so many wonderful reviews and recommendations, and that there's a link to the book at Barrett Bookstore. We'll make sure we'll share that with everybody. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you, Rosanna. I'm very grateful. Really appreciate that.
Let's see. This is a comment, but it's my friend Arpita. As a first-generation immigrant, I'm very proud of my culture and do not shy from representing it. Here's a question. How do you recommend I deal with somewhat veiled comments that make it seem I am less professional because I let my culture show through my life?
Yeah, this is so for people who haven't had experiences like these, these are the daily challenges, and the hardest thing about them is, if you notice the way the question is written, like it's not a specific incident, right? Like, these show up in all sorts of different ways, and the real challenge is, there's no single solution. There's no formulaic answer that we can give one another and say, well, you just ignore it, right? Because in some cases, ignoring it can cause even more harm, right? Like, let's say it's a superior at work who says something like that, and that then reduces your chances at promotion, right? Like that's a real concern. Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say, and this is something that helps me personally, is to recognize that you're not alone in this. And I think that one of the toughest things about racism is that it feels isolating. Like, think about me as a kid growing up in Texas, like what I was describing about not seeing books and movies and film, like it just felt like no one in the world understood what I was going through. And even my close friends growing up, I couldn't talk to them about it. And so there's something helpful about just knowing that there are many people who are there with you. Now that doesn't actually help you on a day-to-day basis. And so the wisdom that I have to offer, and this is something that I think people who come from marginalized backgrounds, right? It's gendered, it's racialized, it's all these other things. We have to learn quickly, right? You as an immigrant, maybe feeling this, like the need for this even more urgently than a lot of us do who are growing up here. Like, we have to learn quickly that our validation cannot come from outside, that we will never please everyone, that there will always be people who are judging us and assuming that we are inferior, and we have to really build up internally that sense of confidence and belief that we have value for who we are. And again, that doesn't address the actual comments, right? Like, those are going to come, and everyone has to figure out their own way of dealing with them in each moment. The only thing that I know to be true is, if you can cultivate yourself in such a way that you are proud of how you respond in those moments, right? The outcome is not going to be perfect, because racism is not perfect and a racist society is not perfect. And so unfortunately, nothing feels like a win in these situations. But if you feel good about yourself, if you can get to a place where you say, I understand these people will say what they say, and I'm going to live by my values and respond with my values in each moment, that's the way you feel like you win in these situations.
Oof, yeah, it's incredible advice. Thank you. I know we're a little bit over, and I know there were more questions. This was just so wonderful and incredibly generous of you, Simran. Thank you so much for all of your thoughtful responses and for all of your questions and comments, everyone. I wanted to say that if this program and what Dr. Singh talked about tonight inspired you and made you want to dig deeper into the work of anti-racism, to learn more and to do more, you're in luck, because the Darien YWCA is launching a program very soon. It's the 14-day Racial Justice Challenge for the community, and it's going to begin on February 22nd. And it's sort of a next step for folks, who want to sort of dig deeper, learn more, and kind of take a next step in this critical work as a community. So if you go to ywcadn.org, ywcadn.org, you can learn more about the 14-day Racial Justice Challenge and register. And it's these daily challenges. So it might be something like reading an article and reflecting on it, or listening to a particular podcast episode and discussing it, or reflecting, doing some personal reflection. I think it's really worthwhile, and I encourage you to sign up. And here at Darien Library, we're going to be looking in the next couple weeks and months to do more events like this and really have these conversations, which can be, oh, thank you. Krishna just shared the link. Thank you, Krishna. Really important conversations to progress the work. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Singh. Best of luck to you and your family, and best of luck on the book. We love it so much. We are really excited for all of your success with it. Pick up your copy at Barrett Bookstore, or stop by the library and join our intergenerational book discussion. And thank you to our community partners and sponsors and the friends of the library. Thank you all so much. Have a good night.